Well, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you on this day at sea. Let's just jump right into today's topic, which is how and why China grew strong. I'll be focusing on the economy. And basically what I'd like to do is relate to you this remarkable story about China's economic growth over the last 40 years. But I'd like to start with a personal story about my husband Paul's cousin in China, a man that I met about 40 years ago. And I'll call him CG, since he doesn't have an English name. And CG is my age. He was born in Xi'an, China. Some of you may be going to Xi'an or maybe already have been there, in 1954. And the 1950s were a relatively stable and hopeful time in China. 5 years after the communist victory. The war was over and rebuilding had begun. But CG's childhood was disrupted. So CG's mother was denounced because her husband and father had served in the army of the previous government. So the whole family was labeled counter-revolutionary, and former friends refused to talk to them. And after CG finished high school, he was lucky enough to get a factory job, which was considered the best kind of job, but no one ever dreamed of starting a business. In those days, all jobs were either with state-owned factories or farms. Private business was banned, and anyone who dared to try was labeled as taking the capitalist road, and they were shunned. So during the 80s, as you know, a major shift happened. China's government changed its economic approach 180 degrees. CG quit his job and founded a company to run a small fleet of taxis. And then he began investing his profits by buying condos and renting them out. And he and his wife made enough money to buy a beautiful 2-story house in a nation where, as you've seen, almost all people live in apartments, and they were able to retire early. Then, catch this, they started making wine in a spare bedroom and built a winery. This is in a tea-drinking country. And that winery grew into another prosperous business, which is now being run by the next generation in the family. And this photo shows a wine tasting that CG, there in the red, did for us and our family. And the first time we tasted their wine, I admit it was awful. But today, amazingly, we've tasted it after several times over the years, and it's pretty good. So these days, CG and his wife spend about half their time in Hainan, which is a Chinese tropical island with white sand beaches that's basically become China's Florida. And back home in America, we would admire CG as an entrepreneur, right? Or maybe even a capitalist. And CG is typical of the first generation of Chinese entrepreneurs who took advantage of Deng Xiaoping's reform policies in the 1980s by going into private business and riding that first wave of economic growth. So my husband actually has several other cousins also who thrived by going into private business as China grew. And many of his cousins own at least one condo and a car, sometimes more than one, which were unthinkable luxuries back in 1982, when they were all living in state-owned housing and riding bikes or buses to work. So 13 of Paul's cousins flew from China to Seattle, where we live, for our daughter's wedding in 2016. And most of them were visiting America for the first time. And they did a little bit of sightseeing, came to the wedding, And then they all returned home to China, drawn back by family, familiarity, and of course, food. So you may have met people from China with similar family stories who experienced their country's transformation firsthand and now live a modern lifestyle inside China. Paul's cousins are just a few of the many Chinese who left the safety of government jobs to take a chance in the once banned private sector. So in 45 years, China grew from one of the poorest countries in the world to the second largest economy. And back in 1980, when I first went to China, its per capita GDP economy was the same as that of Congo and Haiti. And today it's similar to Malaysia and Mexico. So that's only about 16% of the level in the US on a per capita basis. Still, I'm sure you know, China's rapid growth raised alarm bells in the United States and other Western countries. So most Americans, when they visit China these days, are amazed by what they see. Any of you amazed by what you see? Skyscrapers, high-rise apartment buildings, highways, sleek shopping malls that are more modern than many in New York and London and Seattle. So why? Because almost all of China's infrastructure and offices and housing have been built in the last 20 years. Think about that. And as you may know, much of US infrastructure was built in the 50s or earlier, and it was all brand new back then, but some of it is crumbling now. So how did China achieve this economic miracle, especially under communism, which for decades produced sluggish second-rate economies elsewhere? So fortunately, I experienced those early days of transformation during my years as a business reporter covering China in the 1980s. And since then, I've been following every development very closely. So just a quick aside, I'm a former journalist with on-the-ground experience, not a scholar, not an economist. My job was to take complex business and economic stories and make them easy to understand for people who are not experts in that field. And that's my goal today. So I'd like to tell you how and why China defied expectations and grew far faster than anybody would have imagined, while embracing capitalism, but not democracy as we know it. So I hope to show not just why this happened, but what's happening today. Why and how this surge of wealth has raised concerns. So let's address these questions. How did China grow so quickly? How did China get modern technology? Can the United States stop China from overtaking it in key technologies? And what's happening with China's economy today? And finally, also, I'd like to look at the tough question, is economic conflict with China inevitable or avoidable? That's a lot to cover, so let's just jump right in. So first, how did China, a country still run by the Communist Party, catch up to the most advanced countries in the world? So back in the 1980s, when I went to China as a journalist, the Cold War was still raging. Anybody remember the Cold War? I'm sure you remember the mentality of the time. So most of us saw the world in three blocks. So the first world consisted of the US and Western Europe and their allies, in blue here. The second world was the so-called communist bloc, the Soviet Union and its allies. And the third world was basically everybody else. All the other countries, many of them stuck in poverty. That sounds familiar, right? So the leaders of the first world enjoyed advantages of wealth and modern economies. The Soviet Union did develop advanced weapons and nuclear missiles, but Soviet bloc economies were lagging. People had to wait in long, long lines just to buy consumer goods, which were poor quality, and living standards were well below first world levels. And that's because the communist system of that time, with strong government control and state-owned factories, did not produce dynamic growth. And in China, the communists had learned from the Soviets, and after their victory in 1949, the state took ownership of all the land and factories. Most of their capitalists fled. In the 1950s, they built new state-owned factories with Soviet help, but most were, shall we say, not exactly efficient. So although China began a great leap forward to rapidly industrialize in the late 1950s, its methods were, well, let's just say not effective. Famine, political disruptions, as well as the loss of Soviet support during the 60s and 70s slowed economic progress. And the people suffered badly, and so did the economy. When Mao died in 1976, China's per capita income was about $168 per person per year, which was, as I said, about the same as Haiti, which is the line, the green line. China's the blue line there. And by the way, this is what's happened to China and Haiti in the years since then. So Haiti grew a little bit, but barely, while China's income per capita skyrocketed. This was not inevitable. After Mao's death, China's economic policy changed dramatically. Deng Xiaoping, a former high official, returned to power in 1978. And as soon as he took office, he visited modern Asian economies that were working well, specifically Japan and Singapore. And it was Deng Xiaoping who dramatically changed China's direction. During those travels, he learned that the best way for an economy to grow fast is to allow and even nurture private entrepreneurs and allow a robust private sector not only to flourish, but to compete against the public sector. And that would improve productivity and efficiency for both. He basically abandoned the traditional Soviet economic model. And Deng's reforms catapulted the country into fast growth and modernization. This policy change enabled people like Paul's cousins to leave their dull state jobs and become private entrepreneurs. And Deng opened the economy to foreign trade and investment. It sure looked like China was taking the capitalist road. And it did, indeed, allow capitalism to flourish. But the full picture is more complex. The system that Deng created was not capitalism as we know it in the West. Today, it's a hybrid economy, combining market mechanisms with strong central planning. So the government invested heavily in building infrastructure, roads, bridges, subways, airports. That basis allowed private individuals to start their own businesses, work hard, and thrive. Today, private companies and state-owned companies coexist and often compete against each other. And it's true that the largest of the banks are all state-owned, as are electric power and other utilities and infrastructure. But Deng enabled Chinese individuals to pursue their dream of getting rich in many other industries, including factories making goods for export. So in 1985, this was my cover story in Business Week, which was called Capitalism in China. And there certainly was and is capitalism thriving in China. In fact, China has more billionaires than the US. And, this is also surprising, its income inequality level is actually about the same as the US, as measured by the Gini coefficient. So, in fact, both countries rank among the most unequal economies in the world. So, how did Deng Xiaoping do all of this? Back in the 1980s, when I was reporting on business in China, it was all by trial and error. China's leaders, frankly, did not know what they were doing. But they were willing to try new economic reforms and just see what happened. Deng called it crossing the river by feeling for stones. In my reporting with American business people, I certainly heard a lot of griping about how difficult it was to do business in China. But I'll never forget the day I found out that China planned to start a stock exchange. That just struck me as the ultimate in capitalism, right? Now, today we don't think twice about it. It's listed in all the publications. But at that time, it just blew my mind. It felt like China was abandoning socialism altogether. Deng called it socialism with Chinese characteristics, which to some of us in the West back then, maybe even now, seemed like a contradiction. At the same time, China opened to Western influences. As you know, if you watched Dr. Jack's talk, in 1979, under Deng and Carter, as Washington and Beijing formally established diplomatic relations, 1979. And Deng traveled to the US and even tried on a cowboy hat. How many of you remember seeing that on TV? So back in China, universities began broadening their curricula. A few Chinese professors began exploring Western-inspired liberal ideas in art and literature and society, and some Chinese youth began wearing bell-bottoms and listening to rock music that the old guard in China just deemed vulgar. And that set off a backlash, actually, among staunch communists. They called it spiritual pollution. Still, Western ideas began to spread. But Deng didn't want Western ideas about governance. He wanted to open the economy to capitalism, but to keep political power firmly in the hands of the Communist Party. This is an important distinction that a lot of Westerners don't understand. He wanted economic reforms, but not political reforms. So by contrast, the Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, tried to pursue both economic restructuring, which they called perestroika, and political openness, glasnost. You remember those words, at the same time. And it resulted in the fall of the Soviet government and 10 years of economic hardship for Russia. One lesson Beijing learned from that was to keep firm control of politics and don't allow private sector capitalists to drive policy. So in 1990, after a year of turmoil in China, Paul and I moved back to the US with our daughter. And like many other Americans at that point, in 1990, we thought that China's economic reform years were over, that the opportunity for foreigners to do business in China had pretty much ended. But we were wrong. The Chinese Communist Party remained firmly in power, and trade slowed down for a few years, but within 3 years, China resumed Deng's economic reforms, and foreign companies went back and resumed investing and trading there. So since 1992, China's per capita income grew from $300 per year per person to an estimated $13,300 last year. Those of us who have visited China have seen this with our own eyes over the last 20 years. High-speed railways, modern subways, soaring bridges, Gucci handbags, tropical resorts. This is in Hainan Island. I haven't been there. I really would like to go one day. Has anyone ever been to Hainan? Quite a few. So even, and also, brand new Buddhist temples and tourist shopping centers designed to look like ancient towns. Who knew? So none of us could have imagined this 35 years ago when Paul and I left China. So even more impressive, according to the World Bank, since 1978, at least 800 million people in China have risen out of poverty, and half of them have reached middle class or higher. The World Bank considers China not a rich country, but an upper middle income country. And China claims that its rate of extreme poverty fell from 88% in 1981, the first year I went there, 88% of the people in extreme poverty, to almost zero now. But what does that mean, extreme poverty? Actually, the way it's defined by the World Bank, it means income of less than $60 a month. So it basically means that Beijing has eliminated starvation, even in remote areas. That's a major accomplishment, and in keeping with their socialist values. Of course, there are still poor people in China. In 2021, the World Bank estimated that roughly 17% of the population live below another poverty line set by the World Bank for upper middle income countries, roughly $200 a month. And most of those folks live in the countryside and do farming work, or else come to the cities and do hard work as migrant laborers, often in construction. And some drive taxis or ride motorbikes as delivery men in the cities, trying very hard to run over tourists whenever possible. It's hard for them to make ends meet, but they are not starving. That's the difference. So still, China has a huge middle class of at least 400 million people, which is more than the entire population of the United States. And China also has about 50 million wealthy people, about as many as the whole population of Italy. So just imagine the market for Rolex and Tiffany. They were very excited to come here. So today, China's manufacturing output surpasses the manufacturing output of the United States, Japan, Germany, and India combined. China accounts for nearly 29% of all global manufacturing, according to the United Nations. And by 2030, the UN predicts China's share of industry will have risen to 45% of all U.S. industry, of all global industry. And the Wall Street Journal, which is, last I checked, was not seen as very pro-China, calls that a level of dominance unmatched since the U.S.'s post-war manufacturing heyday. And some have called China the world's sole manufacturing superpower. So no other country in the world has brought about such remarkable growth in such a short period of time. And it was done with hard work, ingenuity, and a little help from their friends. Let's get to that. To the second question, how did China get modern manufacturing technology? So my main job as a business reporter was covering U.S. business in China. And I traveled all over the country and interviewed lots of U.S. corporate representatives during China's very earliest days of growth. And China's leaders were very open about their goal of leapfrogging the normal learning process of getting advanced manufacturing know-how from the West. This was not new. It was actually the same path of economic development already taken by Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. There was a pattern out there, and they were following it. So in the early days, China's focus was on low-cost manufacturing like shoes, providing jobs and training for its huge workforce, most of whom had just left the farm. So even back then, Beijing made it very clear their long-term goal was greater than that. In my article that I wrote in 1984, 40 years ago, I quoted a Chinese leader saying they intended to ramp up large-scale production of computers, semiconductors, and electronics. Very few people took them seriously. In fact, back in the 1980s, that seemed extremely far-fetched. Laughable, actually. Most of China's factories were woefully backward. In 1988, Businessweek's editor-in-chief, that guy there in the middle, came to visit China, and I showed him around. And I arranged a tour for him at the Beijing Jeep factory, which was then the most well-known American joint venture investment in China, making Jeeps. And he, who had visited factories all over the world, was just appalled at how dirty and backward and inefficient the factory was. Only a psychic could have predicted that China might one day surpass the United States in any cutting-edge technology. At first, Western companies flocked to China because of the vast market. 1 billion customers. That's a headline of a book that was written at that time. And that prospect just thrilled them. But in those days, frankly, Chinese citizens couldn't afford to buy very much. Within a few years, Western companies' business strategy toward China changed. Rather than selling to China, why not buy from China? Chinese factories could produce toys and clothes and shoes efficiently for low prices, even lower than Hong Kong and Taiwan, which were the lowest at that time. So, eager to widen their profit margin, many Western importers began buying from Chinese factories, which then had very low wages. China had a huge population of underemployed people. Chinese farm girls moved to the factories of southern China, including Shenzhen, and proved to be remarkably adept at factory work. And within a decade, a huge proportion of the products sold in low-cost superstores like Target and Walmart were imported mostly from China. Made in China, you've seen it again and again, right? So as China moved up the technology ladder, producing more and more complex products, foreign experts went over to train them. So our corporations helped them with their manufacturing know-how as a way to lower costs in such industries as clothing, furniture, golf clubs, televisions. Anybody buy a television recently? The prices can be it's kind of amazing how inexpensive you can get a television for. So factory after factory in the US shut down. Industry after industry was lost. But China did not steal those businesses. US executives chose to switch to overseas suppliers because it was in their self-interest. They made more profits when labor was cheaper. And Chinese workers proved to be hardworking and trainable, reliable, adaptable, and relatively cheap. Plus, US consumers benefited from the lower prices of everyday goods. Okay, but wait, I hear somebody thinking, what about intellectual property theft? So I will say, anybody know what these are? Do you remember? Beanie Babies. Back in the 1990s, you could buy counterfeit goods in the back alleys of Beijing. Pirated books, pirated Beanie Babies. I hate to admit it that my husband, who was going to China frequently, that would bring back pirated Beanie Babies by the dozen for our daughter, who was thrilled. We still have a box full of them if any of you would like it. But in Beijing, also, back alley peddlers even sold pirated software on discs. Do you remember when software came on a disc? That's what it looked like. Of course, Microsoft and other companies objected strongly and brought lawsuits, and government officials from Western countries demanded that Beijing stop these pirates. Still, a vast majority of China's know-how came voluntarily from foreign companies, and it was called tech transfer. They viewed China not as a competitor, but as a base for low-cost production. So in recent years, American companies have changed their view dramatically. So many now see China as a competitor. So why the change? Here's some reasons. First, because China has steadily moved up to more advanced technologies. Second, because some Chinese students, after being trained at Western universities, most of them stayed, but some of them returned home and applied their high-tech know-how back in China. And third, because of robust supply chains. So you recognize this guy from Apple. Apple Computer depends heavily on factories in China for iPhones, as I'm sure you know. In recent years, it has begun to diversify to India and Vietnam. But in China, iPhone assembly plants are surrounded by dozens of high-quality parts suppliers. And that whole ecosystem is very hard to replicate in other countries. And fourth, because China now graduates each year at least 3.5 million college and vocational students in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And that's more than 4 times as many as in the US. Plus, China has many highly skilled factory technicians with a wealth of experience quickly adapting to the needs of foreign buyers. That is, hands-on knowledge gained from experience of how to make things and then how to make them better. So China is no longer just a receiver of technology. After learning from the West and Japan, it's developed it further. A great example of this is high-speed rail. How many of you have been yet on high-speed rail? Some of you? Oh, quite a few of you. On the ship, we don't get to try it, but it's well worth trying. Back when China was poor, remember I told you Deng Xiaoping went to Japan? One of the things that he saw there was the bullet train. And he said, I want to have that for China. So it took a while, and it was after he died that they even started it. But in the early 2000s, China formed joint ventures with Japanese companies and European companies to produce high-speed trains in China. And as part of the deal, the foreign firms transferred their technology to those factories in China. And gradually, though, Chinese improved upon the imported technology and developed their own version of it. And as a result, today, some Chinese trains run faster even than the fastest French and Japanese trains. So China has long lagged in technological innovation, but that is starting to change. In recent years, Chinese have filed more international patent applications than any other country. And China is making use of its experienced and educated engineers to gain an edge on some advanced technologies. Among them, solar panels, that's what these are, lithium batteries, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. There's going to be more about that in the next talk I'm going to do, which will be about science and technology in China. So on to question 3, though. Can the United States stop China from overtaking it in key technologies, especially those that matter to our national security? At some level, it can't. The horse is already out of the barn. And for more detail, I'll get into this in a lot more detail in my next talk in a couple of days. But that said, here's some background on that question. So Beijing has already shown that its government is willing to invest heavily to support the development of key technologies. Made in China 2025 was announced way back in 2015. So 10 years ago, they had a long-term plan that clearly spelled out some national targets. They wanted to reduce China's reliance on foreign technology and invest heavily in its own innovations. And it targeted 10 key sectors, including artificial intelligence, drones, cybersecurity, electric cars, and others. And it provided government subsidies to many of them. So now, 10 years later, China has achieved about 90% or more of those goals. And believe me, foreign competitors in those industries are now on high alert. So in my view, as a US citizen, it's vital that we do something. I'm no expert in military technology, but I do know it's important for all Americans and those who depend on the US for defense that the US maintain or regain its lead in key technologies. That won't be easy. But the US has started by supporting American companies that plan to invest in high-tech production at home. And it's also encouraging foreign investment in the US in key industries. For instance, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and Samsung have both invested billions to build new chip plants in the US. I'm sure many of you already know that. And although manufacturing output and jobs have been falling in the US over the years, it might surprise you to learn this positive fact. Overall, last year, US manufacturing construction spending, so the construction of new factories, surged to levels that were 3 times higher than just 5 years ago. And much of that was concentrated in computers and electronic manufacturing. A little piece of good news. So, what works best? The US, under both current and former presidents, has tried export controls on semiconductor chips. But this approach has proved to be complicated. Why? First, the US chip makers are not happy about it. They count on sales to China for profits, which they need to increase their research to stay ahead. And second, Beijing retaliated by sharply limiting its own exports of certain rare earth elements, which we need for high-end magnets and stealth technology. And that hurt industries like electrical vehicles and jet fighters. Also, China's government and industry found ways around the semiconductor export restrictions. They began stockpiling high-end chips, but more important, they invested in speeding up development of their own capability. The US goal was to prevent China from making chips any smaller than 14 nanometers, which is so small I can't make my fingers like that. And as it happens, that goal was unrealistic. Believe it or not, this is a phone, a foldable phone that someone in China has invented. In 2023, less than 1 year after the US imposed export controls, the Chinese company called Huawei surprised the world by announcing that for this new smartphone it had just developed, it was made using the even tinier 7 nanometer microprocessor chip made in China. That surprised the chip world. Also, the Chinese found a way to stack China-made chips to increase their usefulness for AI. The point is that export controls can only be a short-term solution. Chinese companies work extra hard to find their way around them with the goal of becoming self-reliant. So in the end, I believe the best way for the US to maintain its edge is if we continue to invent and invest ahead of China. And I'll talk a lot more about this on Monday afternoon when I talk about technology. So on to question 4. What's happening in China's economy today? I may have given the impression that China is unstoppable, like a high-speed train going uphill, faster and faster. But many of you, I'm sure, have read or seen that China is experiencing a slowdown in its economy. So what's happening? Yes, China's growth is slowing. It grew 5.2% in 2023 and about 5% last year. And that was actually nearly twice as fast as the US. But for China, after years of hyper-fast growth, sometimes higher than 10% a year, that rate is slow. And Beijing is worried. Its consumers are saving too much and not spending enough. Its export manufacturing sector is producing too much and selling at low prices. So instead of inflation, China worries about deflation. Its prices are falling on average. So imagine if we had these problems: high savings, strong manufacturing, and falling prices. But there is an underlying problem. And the underlying problem is that Chinese people are reluctant to increase spending during uncertain times, understandably. And by all accounts, China has some underlying structural concerns as well. So first, China's population is quickly aging. Its birth rate has drastically fallen, leading to an actual decline in its population over the last few years, as you see here. China is no longer the world's most populous country. Anybody know who is? India. In China, more and more people retire each year, and China has almost no immigrants to make up the difference. So the workforce, once so plentiful, has begun to decline. Anticipating this, China is already increasing production and use of robots in factories. Go figure. Second, China's housing, as you've seen, is overbuilt, and developers remain deep in debt with no easy fix in sight. Many of you have already noticed empty apartments in its residential towers along this route. So why? China's government knew that many people would move from the countryside to the cities as the economy grew. So in anticipation, it built apartments for them. But as sometimes happens with central planning, it overshot its target. And now there are too many apartments and not enough buyers. So in the past, many Chinese used their savings to buy a second apartment or a third or fourth as an investment, in part because they don't yet quite trust the stock market. And also, they just have this cultural thing that real estate is a safe investment. But now those apartments have fallen in value, and the buyers are stuck with big mortgages. Plus, unlike Americans who do have savings, and the Chinese don't trust the stock market, so they're just sitting on their savings. So third, although China's exports surged last year, creating a trade surplus of nearly $1 trillion, 3 times the level in 2018, that soured relations with the US and Europe and other countries whose own industries can't compete on price. This year, as you know, China faces strong headwinds and uncertainties in trade. It's already begun pivoting and selling to markets in third countries, including Southeast Asia and Africa. China's government knows it needs a new growth model to replace the old approach, which depended too heavily on subsidies for manufacturing and export growth. For many years, it's been trying to shift from dependence on trade to growth generated within the country. That means not only greater self-reliance in science and technology, but also encouraging people to spend more, especially for services like cruise ships. I think this ship is going to welcome some Chinese-speaking tourists in the future. So for all its achievements, China has its economic worries, too. So finally, is economic conflict with China inevitable? It seems that way. But is there any chance that the US and China could just settle into some healthy competition? That remains to be seen. China's system has some advantages, including long-term planning, big government subsidies for technologies it targets, and a massive, well-trained workforce with advanced hands-on manufacturing experience. Plus, I'd like to add plentiful cheap electricity and a sophisticated digital network. But innovation has thrived in the US for a long time, partly because our system is very open. It encourages and rewards innovative entrepreneurs. And we attract amazing brains from around the world. And our highly developed financial system helps funnel money into promising new companies. That's a lot of advantages. So it's possible there's room for both China and the US to grow and compete, to thrive, and to create better lives for their people. I certainly hope so. So that's it for my talk. I just wanted to add, I really enjoy hearing your questions and thoughts, but we can't do it inside the theater because we have a port talk at 4:30. So if anybody would like to talk to me and continue the discussion, I'm going to gather up my computer and stand outside the door. So thanks very much.